He never complained, never posted a video, never blocked a gate. He just quietly switched, and 4 years later, John Deere drove 4 hours to his farm to find out why an entire county had followed him. It was a Tuesday morning in April of 2018, and Clifton War was in the cab of his John Deere 8285R on the third day of planting when the hydraulic system threw a fault code that stopped the machine in the middle of his east field outside Bowling Green, Missouri. And Clifton climbed down and looked at the fault code and called Harlan Drove's dealership on Route 61 and described what the display was showing, and Harlan's service advisor told him to bring the machine in, and Clifton brought it in that afternoon and left it and drove home in his truck and started the mental calculation that every farmer starts when a machine goes down during planting, the calculation of days and acres and weather windows and what the margin is between the delay being manageable and the delay becoming something that costs real money in real yield at the end of a real season. And the calculation told him what it tells every farmer who runs it during planting, which was that the margin was not wide and was narrowing with every day the machine sat at Harlan Drove's dealership while the April weather held and the planting window moved forward without him. The diagnosis came back on April 3rd, a Thursday, and the service advisor called Clifton at 7 in the morning and told him the hydraulic pressure valve assembly had failed, a known failure mode on the 8285R platform, and that the repair was covered under the machine's extended warranty. And Clifton said, "How long?" And the service advisor said, "We can have it back to you Monday." And Clifton said, "Monday is acceptable," and went back to his other machines and worked his remaining acres around the east field and told himself that Monday was tight but manageable, and that the warranty coverage meant the repair was going to cost him time but not money, which was the better of the two costs a breakdown during planting can produce. Harlan Drove called personally on Friday afternoon at 4:30, and Clifton was in his equipment shed when the call came and he answered it, and Harlan said, "Clifton, I've got a situation with your repair." And Clifton said, "What situation?" And Harlan said, "John Deere's warranty authorization team has come back with a denial on the hydraulic valve assembly." And the word denial landed in the equipment shed the way certain words land when they arrive at the end of a sequence that gave you no reason to expect them, with the specific weight of something that requires a moment to be processed correctly before it can be responded to. And Clifton said, "On what basis?" And Harlan said, "They're citing a modification flag on the machine's service record. They say a non-authorized fluid was used in the hydraulic system during a service interval." And Clifton said, "Harlan, I have used your dealership for every service interval on that machine since I bought it in 2014. Every oil change and every fluid service and every scheduled maintenance. Your technicians have serviced that machine exclusively for 4 years. And Harlan said, "I know that, Clifton." And Clifton said, "Then where is the non-authorized fluid coming from?" And Harlan said, "The authorization team is saying the fluid currently in the system tests outside their specification range." And Clifton said, "Is it possible your technician used the wrong fluid at the last service?" And there was a pause on Harlan's end of the call that lasted long enough to be an answer in itself. And then Harlan said, "I'm going to look into that, Clifton." And Clifton said, "I would appreciate that," and hung up and stood in his equipment shed and looked at the 8285R's empty bay and felt the specific cold clarity of a man who has just understood something he would have preferred not to understand, which was that the machine he had paid $312,000 for and maintained exclusively through the authorized dealer network for 4 years had been denied a warranty repair on the basis of a fluid specification issue that the authorized dealer's own technician had most likely created, and that the cost of the repair that the warranty was refusing to cover was going to land on Clifton War and not on Harlan Drove, and not on John Deere's warranty authorization team, and not on the technician who had serviced the hydraulic system at the last interval. And Clifton was not a man who responded to this kind of understanding with anger, was instead a man who responded to it with the cold, precise accounting that his father had taught him, and his father's father had taught his father, the accounting that does not inflate what has happened or minimize it, but records it accurately accurately and completely and draws from the accurate and complete record whatever conclusion the record honestly supports. Harlan called back on Saturday morning and said the investigation into the fluid service had been inconclusive, which Clifton understood to mean that it had been conclusive in a direction that Harlan was not prepared to act on, and that John Deere's warranty authorization team had reviewed the denial and was maintaining it, and that the repair cost would be $11,400 including parts and labor. And Clifton said, "Harlan, your technician serviced that machine." And Harlan said, "Clifton, I can't prove that the fluid issue came from our service." And Clifton said, "Can you prove it didn't?" And Harlan said nothing. And Clifton said, "I would like my machine back by Monday as originally scheduled. I will pay the $11,400 under protest, and I want a written record of this conversation." And Harlan said, "I'll have the paperwork ready." And Clifton said, "Thank you, Harlan," and hung up and went inside and sat at the kitchen table where Marin was drinking her morning coffee, and Marin looked at him and said, "How bad?" And Clifton said, $11,400 and 14 days of planting season. And Marin said, "What are you going to do?" And Clifton looked out the kitchen window at the empty equipment shed bay and said, "I'm going to finish planting." And Marin said, "And after that?" And Clifton said, "After that, I'm going to make a decision." And the way he said it, quietly and without emphasis, and with the complete finality of a man who has already made the decision and is simply allowing the appropriate amount of time to pass before executing it, told Marin everything she needed to know about what the decision was going to be. Clifton paid the $11,400 on Monday, April 9th, when he picked up the 8285R from Harlan Drove's dealership, paid it with the checking account he kept for equipment expenses, and took the receipt and the written record of the warranty denial and the fluid specification dispute and put them in the manila folder he kept for documents that required keeping, and drove the machine home and finished his planting across the remaining days of the window that the breakdown had left him, working longer hours than the calendar required because the 14 lost days had compressed what remained, and compression during planting is the kind of problem that only one thing solves, which is hours. And Clifton put in the hours without complaint and without the kind of internal narrative that turns a difficult week into a grievance, just put in the hours because the hours were what the situation required, and what the situation required was what Clifton Ward did. And by April 17th, the planting was complete and the fields were done, and Clifton was sitting at his kitchen table in the evening with the manila folder open in front of him and the $11,400 receipt on top and the written record of the warranty denial beneath it and the service history of the 8285R beneath that, 4 years of authorized dealer service at Harlan Drove's dealership, every interval documented, every fluid service recorded in Harlan's own service system. And Clifton looked at the documents for a long time with the focused accounting attention that the documents deserved, and then picked up his phone and called John Deere's customer service number and spoke with a representative named Angela, who listened to the full account of the warranty denial and the fluid specification dispute and the service history, and said she would escalate the case to a regional review team and that someone would be in contact within 5 to 7 business days. And Clifton said, "Thank you, Angela," and hung up and waited. The regional review call came on April 24th from a man named Terry who had a regional title that Clifton did not write down because titles were not the information he needed. And Terry had reviewed the case file and was prepared to offer Clifton a goodwill credit of $2,800 toward a future John Deere parts or service purchase. And Clifton said, "Terry, the warranty denial cost me $11,400 in repair costs and 14 days of planting season on a machine I have maintained exclusively through the authorized dealer network for 4 years. And Terry said, "I understand your frustration, Mr. War." And Clifton said, "I'm not frustrated, Terry. I'm accounting. There is a difference." And Terry said, "The goodwill credit represents John Deere's recognition that your experience fell below our service standards." And Clifton said, "It represents $2,800 against $11,400. And Terry said, "It's the maximum authorization available at the regional review level." And Clifton said, "Is there a level above regional review?" And Terry said, "There is a corporate customer relations process that cases can be escalated to." And Clifton said, "I would like to escalate." And Terry said, "I'll submit the escalation request." And Clifton said, "Thank you, Terry," and hung up and waited again with the patience of a man who understands that waiting is not passive, but is the active choice to allow a process to complete itself before forming a conclusion about what the process has produced. The corporate customer relations call came on May 2nd from a woman named Patricia who had reviewed the full case file, including the regional review, and was prepared to offer Clifton a goodwill credit of $4,500 toward a future John Deere equipment purchase. And Clifton said, "Patricia, I bought a $312,000 machine and maintained it for 4 years through the authorized dealer network, and the authorized dealer network serviced it incorrectly, and John Deere's warranty authorization team denied the repair on the basis of the incorrect service and charged me $11,400 to fix a problem that the authorized service created." And Patricia said, "Mr. War, we are not in a position to confirm that the fluid specification issue originated with dealer service." And Clifton said, "Are you in a position to confirm that it didn't?" And Patricia said, "The investigation was inconclusive." And Clifton said, "Harlan Drove told me the same thing." And Patricia said, "The $4,500 goodwill credit is the maximum authorization available at the corporate customer relations level." And Clifton said, "Is there a level above corporate customer relations?" And Patricia said, "Not for cases of this type." And Clifton said, "Then I want to make sure I understand correctly. John Deere's final position on this matter is a $4,500 goodwill credit toward a future purchase from the company that just charged me $11,400 to repair damage most likely caused by the company's own authorized service network." And Patricia said, "That is our offer, Mr. War." And Clifton said, "Thank you, Patricia. I appreciate your time," and hung up. And that was the last call Clifton War ever made to John Deere about anything. The last contact of any kind he initiated with the company on April 17, 2018 at 4:51 in the afternoon. And he closed the manila folder and put it in the filing cabinet in his office and went out to his equipment shed and stood in the doorway looking at his 4 John Deere machines in the evening light, the 8285R and the 2 utility tractors and the combine, and looked at them for a long time with the expression Marin had learned over 32 years of marriage to recognize as the expression of a man who has completed an accounting and is now reading the result. And then he went inside and sat at the kitchen table and said to Marin, "I'm going to sell them."
And Marin said, "All 4. And Clifton said, "All 4. And Marin said, "And replace them with." And Clifton said, "Case IH." And Marin said, "You've never run Case IH." And Clifton said, "I've never had a reason to before." And Marin looked at him across the table with the steady regard of a woman who has been married to a principled man long enough to know that his principles are not performances, and that when he arrives at a decision through the process she had watched him use since April 3rd, the decision is not going to change regardless of what she says about it. And she said, "Then we run Case IH." And Clifton said, "Yes." And that was the entirety of the conversation that ended John Deere's 31-year relationship with Clifton War's farming operation. No drama and no anger and no public declaration. Just 2 people at a kitchen table in Pike County, Missouri on an April evening confirming a conclusion that the accounting had already reached. The 4 John Deere machines left Clifton's operation across 3 weeks in May of 2018, sold through a farm equipment dealer in Hannibal who handled the transactions without drama and without ceremony, and the Case IH machines that replaced them arrived with the specific unfamiliarity of equipment that a man knows by reputation and specification but has not yet learned by operation. And Clifton spent the first weeks with the new machines the way he spent the first weeks with anything unfamiliar, attentively and without rushing his conclusions, learning the differences in feel and response and operational character that every equipment brand carries in its engineering the way every person carries their history in the way they move through the world. And by the end of the first summer, Clifton had formed the considered opinion of a man who has operated one brand exclusively for 31 years and has now operated another for 3 months, which was that the Case IH machines were good machines, genuinely good, not better than the John Deere's in every measurable dimension and not worse in every measurable dimension, but different in the way that honest alternatives are different, each with its own strengths and its own particular character. And the difference that mattered most to Clifton was not mechanical, but structural, which was that the Case IH dealer in Louisiana, Missouri, a man named Frank Elbert, who had been selling and servicing Case IH equipment in Pike County for 19 years, ran his service operation with the transparent accountability that Clifton had believed Harlan Drove's dealership had been running and had discovered in April it had not been running. And the transparency was not a marketing claim, but operational reality that Clifton verified the way he verified everything, by watching how the service department behaved when something went wrong rather than when everything went right. Because the character of a service operation is not visible in its successes, which any competent organization can produce, but in its failures, which only honest organizations handle correctly. He told Boyd Sellers in September of 2018, and the telling was not a campaign and not a complaint, but a conversation. The kind of conversation that happens between neighboring farmers who have known each other for 20 years and who trust each other with the specific trust that comes from 2 decades of shared fence lines and shared weather and the shared understanding that what is true for one operation's economics is often relevant to the others. And Boyd had asked Clifton at the grain elevator in Bowling Green why he was running Case IH now, and Clifton had told him, starting with April 3rd and the fault code and the warranty denial and the fluid specification dispute and the $11,400 and ending with Patricia's $4,500 goodwill credit offer and the April 17th phone call that was the last one he made. And Boyd had listened with the complete attention of a man receiving information about a company he currently owes $280,000 to for 2 John Deere machines sitting in his equipment shed. And when Clifton finished, Boyd said, "And the Case IH." And Clifton said, "Frank Elbert runs an honest service operation and his machines do what I need them to do." And Boyd said, "That's it?" And Clifton said, "That's everything." And Boyd said, "No anger?" And Clifton said, "Anger is not an accounting category, Boyd. I ran the numbers and made the decision the numbers supported." And Boyd looked at him for a moment and said, "I'm going to think about this." And Clifton said, "That's all I'm suggesting," and drove home and said nothing more about it to Boyd or to anyone else unless they asked, because asking was the threshold Clifton had set for himself on the question of sharing what had happened in April. He was not going to raise it unprompted because unprompted was advocacy, and advocacy was not what Clifton Ward did with his opinions about equipment or anything else. But if a neighboring farmer asked him directly why he had switched from John Deere to Case IH after 31 years, he was going to answer the question with the same precision and completeness he brought to every accounting, because a neighbor who asked deserved an honest answer, and an honest answer required the full account, and the full account started on April 3rd and ended on April 17th, and included every number and every conversation and every document in the manila folder in his filing cabinet. He told 10 more farmers across the fall and winter of 2018 and early 2019 in the same way he told Boyd, not by raising it, but by answering it when they asked. And they asked because word moves through farming communities the way water moves through soil, along the paths of least resistance, which are the paths of existing trust. And the existing trust in Pike County, Missouri ran through Clifton War as reliably as it ran through anyone in the county, because Clifton had been farming his 290 acres with the kind of visible integrity that builds the specific trust that causes people to ask a man his opinion when they see him make a significant change in a direction they did not expect. And the 11 conversations Clifton had between September 2018 and March 2019 were all the same conversation in the same register, factual and complete and entirely without the emotional inflation that turns a legitimate grievance into a story that loses credibility as it travels. And because the conversations were factual and complete and without inflation, they traveled through Pike County with the fidelity that factual and complete accounts always travel when they originate from a source the community trusts, arriving at each new stop in the same condition they left the previous one. And what they said at every stop was the same thing they said at the first stop, which was that Clifton War had run John Deere equipment for 31 years and maintained it exclusively through the authorized dealer network, and had been charged $11,400 to repair damage most likely caused by the authorized dealer's own service technician, and had been offered $4,500 in goodwill credit as John Deere's final response, and had switched to Case IH and found Frank Elbert's operation honest and his machines adequate, and had no complaint to make and no campaign to run, and was simply answering the question he had been asked. And the 11 farmers who received that account went home and sat at their own kitchen tables and ran their own accountings with the specific attention of people who have just been given information that is directly relevant to decisions they are currently making or will soon need to make. And 9 of them arrived at conclusions that produced changes in their equipment purchasing decisions within the following 24 months, not because Clifton had asked them to, and not because they were following anyone, but because the accounting supported the change the same way it had supported the change for Clifton. And the 9 changes produced conversations of their own that traveled further into Pike County and into the adjacent counties along the same paths of existing trust that Clifton's original conversations had traveled. And by the end of 2021, the conversation that had begun at the Bowling Green grain elevator in September of 2018 had reached further than Clifton knew and had produced more than Clifton had intended, and had done both things entirely without Clifton's active participation after the 11 original conversations, running on its own through the trust networks of rural Missouri the way any true account runs when it is given to people who know how to evaluate it and have reasons to care about what it says.
David Castile had been John Deere's regional director for the Missouri and Southern Illinois territory for 6 years when the 2021 annual sales analysis landed on his desk in January of 2022 and showed him something in the Pike County, Missouri data that he had not seen in 6 years of reading regional sales analyses, which was a sustained and accelerating decline in new equipment sales across a county that had no obvious explanation in the variables that regional sales analyses typically use to explain sustained and accelerating declines, no major employer departure, and no unusual weather pattern, and no competing dealer opening, and no demographic shift visible in the agricultural census data. Just a steady reduction in John Deere equipment purchases across Pike County, beginning in the second half of 2018 and compounding annually through 2019 and 2020 and 2021 until the 2021 numbers showed a 34% reduction from the 2017 baseline. And 34% over 4 years in a county with no structural explanation was not a market fluctuation and was not a coincidence and was not something that David Castile's 6 years of regional analysis experience allowed him to file under normal variance and move on from. And he pulled the Pike County dealer reports and the service records and the customer retention data and the conquest and defection tracking that John Deere's customer relationship system maintained and looked at all of it with the focused attention of a man trying to find the thread that explains a pattern. And the thread he found after 3 days of looking was a defection cluster, a group of farming operations that had switched away from John Deere equipment beginning in mid-2018 and that were connected to each other not geographically in the simple sense, but relationally, connected through the kind of informal community network that customer relationship systems are not designed to map because customer relationship systems map transactions, and transactions do not record the conversations that precede them or the trust relationships that make those conversations credible. And the center of the defection cluster, the point from which the relational connections radiated outward when David mapped them manually using dealer records and county agricultural extension data and the kind of patient cross-referencing that his analytical instinct told him the pattern required, was a farming operation outside Bowling Green owned by a man named Clifton War, who had purchased 4 John Deere machines between 2009 and 2014 and had serviced them exclusively through Harlan Drove's dealership for years, and had sold all 4 in May of 2018 and had not purchased a single John Deere machine or part or service since April 17th of that year. And David pulled Clifton War's complete customer file and read it from the beginning and found the April 2018 warranty denial on the 8285R hydraulic valve assembly and the fluid specification dispute and the $11,400 repair charge and the regional review offer of $2,800 and the corporate customer relations offer of $4,500 and Clifton's April 17th call to Patricia in corporate customer relations, which was documented as the last customer-initiated contact in the file. And David read the file twice and sat with it for a long time and felt the specific discomfort of a man who is looking at the documented record of his company's behavior toward a customer and finding that the record does not reflect well on the company. The discomfort that is different from guilt because David had not been involved in the 2018 events and different from indifference because the 2022 sales data made indifference impossible and was instead the discomfort of responsibility, the feeling of a man who is accountable for outcomes he did not create but cannot disclaim because accountability does not require personal participation in the original action, only authority over the territory in which the action occurred, and David had had that authority since 2016.
He called Harlan Drove in February, and the conversation was direct and uncomfortable in the way that conversations are direct and uncomfortable when a regional director calls an authorized dealer about a 4-year-old service dispute that has cost the regional territory 34% of a county's equipment sales. And Harlan said what Harlan had said in 2018, which was that the fluid specification investigation had been inconclusive. And David said, "Harlan, I have the service records for that machine, and the service records show that your technicians performed every hydraulic fluid service on that machine for 4 years." And Harlan said, "I know that." And David said, "Then inconclusive is a word I would encourage you to think carefully about." And Harlan was quiet for a moment and said, "What do you want me to do?" And David said, "I'm not asking you to do anything right now. I'm asking you to be honest with me about what happened in April of 2018. And Harlan said, "My technician used the wrong fluid grade at the February 2018 service." And David said, "And you knew that in April." And Harlan said, "I suspected it." And David said,
"And you reported the investigation as inconclusive." And Harlan said, "I didn't have written confirmation." And David said, "Harlan, a farmer who had been your customer for 9 years, paid $11,400 to repair damage your technician most likely caused, and you reported the investigation as inconclusive because you didn't have written confirmation." And Harlan said nothing, and David said, "I'm going to need a written account of this conversation." And Harlan said, "David?" And David said, "A written account, Harlan," and hung up, and sat at his desk in the St. Louis office and looked at the Pike County sales chart showing 34% decline from a 2017 baseline, and thought about Clifton War sitting at a kitchen table in Bowling Green, Missouri in April of 2018 with an $11,400 receipt and a $4,500 goodwill offer and a phone in his hand, making the last call he was ever going to make to John Deere. And David thought about what that moment had produced across 4 years in Pike County, Missouri, without Clifton War raising his voice or filing a complaint or posting a single word anywhere that David's team could have found and monitored and responded to, produced through nothing more than 11 honest conversations with neighboring farmers who trusted the man having them. And David understood that what he was looking at was not a customer defection problem or a dealer service failure or a warranty process breakdown, though it was all 3 of those things, but was something more fundamental, was the documented consequence of a company treating one principled man's legitimate grievance as a line item to be minimized rather than a wrong to be corrected. And the consequence was not what the minimization had saved, which was $6,900 between the $11,400 repair cost and the $4,500 goodwill offer, but what it had cost, which was a county and its surrounding conversations and the trust of every farmer those conversations had reached. And David looked at the number for a long time and then looked at Clifton War's address in the customer file and made a decision that his regional director role did not require him to make and that his understanding of what the file documented told him he needed to make anyway, which was to drive to Bowling Green, Missouri on a Tuesday morning in March and knock on a door and say something that John Deere's customer relationship system had no protocol for and that David was going to have to find the words for himself.
David Castile left St. Louis at 5:45 on the morning of March 8, 2022, and drove the 4 hours to Bowling Green, Missouri on the interstate and then on the county roads that the GPS took him down in the final 20 minutes, the roads that in early March in Pike County have the specific quality of ground that is finishing its winter and not yet begun its spring. Fields still showing the gray-brown of harvested corn, and the fence lines carrying the particular bareness of trees that have not yet decided to commit to the season. And David drove those roads in his company vehicle with Clifton War's customer file on the passenger seat and the written account from Harlan Drove in the folder beneath it, and the speech he had been composing since February in his head, revising it the way a man revises something he knows he has to say correctly because there is no second opportunity to say it correctly, and the first opportunity is going to arrive in 4 hours, and then in 3 hours, and then in the final 20 minutes on the county roads, and then in the driveway of a 290-acre farm outside Bowling Green, where a man he had never met was going to open a door and find a John Deere regional director standing on his porch on a Tuesday morning without an appointment, and would need a reason to listen to anything David had driven 4 hours to say. Clifton was in his equipment shed at 8:50 when the company vehicle turned into his driveway, and he saw it from the shed doorway and watched it park, and watched a man in a company jacket climb out and look at the shed and walk toward it with the purposeful directness of someone who knows where they are going and has decided how they are going to get there. And Clifton waited in the shed doorway with the patient stillness of a man who receives whatever arrives at his farm with the same steady attention he gives everything. And David reached the shed doorway and said, "Mr. War, my name is David Castile. I'm the regional director for John Deere's Missouri and Southern Illinois territory." And Clifton looked at him and said, "I know who you are." And David said, "You do?" And Clifton said, "You called Harlan Drove in February. Harlan told Boyd Sellers. Boyd told me." And David absorbed this information with the expression of a man who has just discovered that the community he drove 4 hours to reach had known he was coming before he arrived, and said, "Then you know why I'm here." And Clifton said, "I have a reasonable idea." And David said, "I'd like to talk to you, Mr. War, if you're willing." And Clifton looked at him for a moment and said, "Come inside." And they walked to the farmhouse, and Morin was in the kitchen, and Clifton said, "Morin, this is David Castile from John Deere." And Morin looked at David with the specific regard of a woman who has watched her husband carry something for 4 years, and is now looking at the person who gave him the thing he has been carrying, and said, "I'll make coffee," which in Morin War's register was not hospitality, but a statement of intent to remain in the room. And the three of them sat at the kitchen table where Clifton had sat in April of 2018 with the $11,400 receipt and the $4,500 goodwill offer, and David put the folder on the table and said, "Mr. War, I've read your complete customer file, and I've spoken with Harlan Drove, and I have a written account from him confirming that his technician used the incorrect hydraulic fluid grade at your February 2018 service interval, and that he knew this when he reported the warranty investigation as inconclusive in April of 2018. And Clifton said, "I know that." And David said, "I'm here to tell you that what John Deere did in April of 2018 was wrong. The warranty denial was wrong, and the dealer's handling was wrong, and the customer relations response was wrong, and I am sorry." And the kitchen was quiet in the way that kitchens are quiet when something has been said that the room did not know it was waiting for until it arrived. And Clifton looked at David with the steady expression of a man receiving information and assessing it the way he assessed everything, for accuracy and completeness and the presence or absence of what his father had called the accounting behind the accounting, the real number underneath the presented number, and said, "What do you want, David?" And David said, "I want to make it right," and put the second document on the table, a check made out to Clifton War for $11,400, the full original repair cost, no goodwill credit and no future purchase condition, just the number the accounting had always said was the correct number.
And Clifton looked at the check and looked at David and said, "It took 4 years." And David said, "It took me 6 weeks from the day I found your file." And Clifton said, "It took John Deere 4 years." And David said, "Yes," and did not add anything to the yes, because the yes was complete, and adding anything to it would have made it smaller. And Clifton said, "What do you want in return?" And David said, "Nothing." And Clifton said, "Nothing." And David said, "The check is what John Deere owes you, Mr. War. It's not a negotiation, and it's not a goodwill credit, and it doesn't have a condition attached to it. It's the money that should have been in your account in April of 2018 and wasn't, and I'm putting it on your table because it belongs here." And Clifton looked at the check for a long moment, and then looked at Morin, and Morin said, "What about the 34%? And the question landed on the table beside the check with the specific weight of something that has been held back until exactly the right moment. And David looked at Morin and said, "I'm sorry." And Morin said, "I'm not asking for an apology. I'm asking whether John Deere understands what the 34% means." And David said, "It means that one farmer's honest account of a wrong that wasn't corrected traveled further through a community's trust than any complaint or protest could have traveled." And Morin said, "It means that people out here talk to each other, and they trust each other, and when you wrong one of them honestly and don't correct it honestly, the conversation that follows goes places you can't follow it, and does things you can't undo." And David said, "I understand that now." And Morin said, "Does John Deere understand it?" And David looked at her and said, "I'm going to make sure they do," which was not a corporate promise and not a regional director commitment, but a personal statement from a man who had driven 4 hours on a Tuesday morning because his own understanding had required it, and whose understanding of what Morin had just said was going to require something further from him that he had not fully defined yet, but that the drive back to St. Louis was going to give him time to begin defining. Clifton picked up the check and looked at it and set it back on the table and said, "I'm not switching back, David." And David said, "I'm not asking you to." And Clifton said, "Frank Elbert runs an honest operation, and his machines do what I need them to do." And David said, "I know." And Clifton said, "I'll tell Boyd Sellers you came." And David said, "Tell him whatever you think is accurate." And Clifton said, "I'll tell him you drove 4 hours and put the right number on the table without a condition and said you were sorry." And David said, "That's accurate." And Clifton said, "Out here, that counts for something." And David said, "I hope it does," and stood up and shook Clifton's hand and nodded to Morin and walked back to his company vehicle in the March morning and drove out of the driveway and back down the county roads toward the interstate and toward St. Louis.
and Clifton stood at the kitchen window and watched the vehicle go the way he had watched Brandon Coel's vehicle go, and the way he had watched every vehicle go that had arrived at his farm with something to resolve and left it with it resolved or unresolved. And then he picked up the check from the table and put it in the manila folder in his filing cabinet beside the $11,400 receipt and the warranty denial and the fluid specification dispute and Patricia's goodwill credit offer and the record of the April 17th phone call. And the folder was complete now in the way that a thing is complete when its final document has been added and the accounting it represents has reached its honest conclusion. And Clifton went back to his equipment shed and started his case IH and went to work on his 290 acres the way he went to work every morning, without drama and without grievance, and with the patient integrity of a man who had never needed John Deere to come to his door to know that the accounting had always said what it said, and had never needed the check to know that the right number had always been the right number, and had never needed the apology to know that what happened in April of 2018 was wrong. Had known all of those things since the evening he sat at the kitchen table and told Marin he was going to sell the machines, and had simply gone on farming in the honest and principled way that his father had farmed, and his father's father had farmed before him, which was the only way Clifton War had ever known how to farm, and the only way on the morning of March 8, 2022, with a check in his filing cabinet and a case IH running in his equipment shed and a John Deere regional director 4 hours down the road toward St. Louis, that he intended to continue.